This is the third webinar of a series of online events entitled New Perspectives on Collective Healing, Social Justice and Wellbeing. This series contains 7 monthly webinars in 2023, bringing together diverse voices of distinguished and inspirational speakers, including scholars, researchers, activists, and practitioners. The purpose of these webinars is to provide in-depth analysis of the need for collective healing following historical atrocities and brutalities, such as transatlantic enslavement, colonialism, wars, and genocide of indigenous people, and to reflect on the ways that communities, institutions, and even governments might collaborate to address the legacies of dehumanization and support the well-being of all. This series of webinars is co-convened by UNESCO Roots of the Enslaved Peoples Project and the Global Humanity for Peace Institute at the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. My name is Chateau Gill. I'm the director of the Institute. I'm honored to be moderating today's session. We will be exploring the significance of narratives and public spaces in healing, justice, and well-being. We invite you to reflect on questions such as, how should we understand narrative? What are the dehumanizing narratives and how are they propagated and perpetuated? And what are the humanizing alternatives? And why is it so important to transform narratives now? We are blessed with the presence of 2 of the most celebrated thinkers, scholars, and researchers who will discuss and dialogue about these questions. Now, Professor Ali Moussaie is a professor of practice at University of Wales. He is currently the founder and the chair of the think tank Afrospectives, a global Africa initiative. Before founding the think tank, Ali Moussa was the head of the UNESCO History and Memory for Dialogue Department and directed 2 very important UNESCO programs, the Roots of Dialogue program and the General and Regional Histories program. Another speaker is Esther Ammar. She's an author, playwright, and a former journalist. She's the CEO of Ammar Institute of Emotional Justice. She's the author of a book entitled Emotional Justice, A Roadmap for Racial Healing. As we should soon learn more, emotional justice is a racial healing roadmap that Esther created over 15 years of time through assignment research and community engagement in 3 different continents. Ali Moussa and Ammar, I now turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Sherto. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleague, it's a great pleasure and honor to participate in this 3rd UNESCO webinar organized by the Global Humanity for Peace Institute. Thanks you, Sherto, for bringing us together and facilitating this dialogue with Esther Ammar, who is doing a fantastic work on the emotional justice. And it's nice to have this opportunity to exchange with you, dear Esther. I wish to apologize for our English-speaking participant as I am making my presentation in French, the foreign language. I feel a bit more comfortable to express my idea. But there is the interpretation.
Narratives, in fact, are like entities with their own history, with a trajectory of their own. In fact, just like rumors, they end up escaping the control of those who created them, and the capacity to invent a mythology or a narrative on our past, present, or future is perhaps what distinguishes human beings mostly from the rest of their counterparts among creatures here. They have always been able to make up and invent mythologies or histories about their own past, and that's acted as a sort of a momentum and engine, pushing them or propelling them towards a future with a certain direction. and sense of purpose. So obviously the mystery of creation, death, transcendence have to find their place in those mythological narratives, but also our mutual space and role within a community or within society. Religions, of course, first and foremost, usually interested in the transcendental dimension, so to speak, of our place and role or mission here on Earth, and a connection between the beyond, the world beyond the visible phenomenological world and our current world. And so social sciences are usually most commonly dealing with the horizontal dimension, basically, of those historical narratives. Some of them are instrumentalized more with an economic bias or with a religious or philosophical bias, and cultural expressions are sometimes used to kidnap some of these narratives, certain myths, such as that of an elected people or of a royal power that would embody the will of God and be empowered and mandated with a specific mission to bring and carry forward a specific tribe or an elected people, are part of such examples. Some narratives also offer a reading grid in order to simply match the anxieties of human beings in their daily lives. But one of the most strategic narratives, in my opinion, is the one used in situations of conquests or domination and exploitations in order to justify certain power relationships. Among common European observers, it is agreed that the 16th century was a very important turning point in terms of narratives. The way in which the world was conquered was pictured in a different way. For the first time, this century was viewed as the as a century of discovery, and yet it was also the beginning and starting point for slavery. In fact, slavery as discovered and exploited out of one specific continent, especially the African one. So there was a specific humankind theory that was put at the center and in the limelight, namely that of humanism, so to speak, putting mankind at the heart of evolution and at the top of all the other creatures. A universalist theory in the 18th century later on transformed this European specificity or singularity into the only path for redemption, so to speak, of humankind. And finally, the implementation of an economic system that followed suit to this series of adopted values. But in my opinion, the ultimate major European narrative has to do with the use of science to further promote the relevance of their supreme visions and supreme values, basically. Their supposed belief in objectivity, experimentation, and some unalienable scientific laws that would explain everything that happens or takes place in nature was another powerful tool used to disqualify basically any other knowledge or analytical tool, and downrank them to the level of simple superstition. Who could resist, indeed, this specific truth epistemology freed from myths and superstition? How could you not succumb to some powerful narratives that were then so beautifully illustrated by painters, sculptures, cinema, and also movies brought to the screen? Look at the Western movies, for example, and how the cowboys sort of turned the Indians and all kind of local people who were suddenly turned into barbarians trying to eradicate or assault the brave European or Western heroes, in fact. more than generally speaking, narratives usually have a limited life expectancy, so to speak, and they tend to be shaken when there is a major sociological or political upheaval. For example, this was the case for the end of the Egyptian or Mongol empires, to name but a few. But European narratives have this edge that by claiming their identification with a scientific narrative, they've managed to disqualify, as I said, any other and prior narrative. And they've also made sure that it was securely tied with a global economic narrative that further strengthened their legitimacy and their sustainability. Allow me to take an example in order to show you how difficult it is to question these narratives, which have literally been forging our vision of the world. Moving on to the first slide of my presentation. So you can see here the most common world geographical map that most people are using for any of their travels, and it's called Mercator projection. It is centered around Europe. It was created in the middle of the 16th century, and it clearly illustrates the Euro-centered vision of the world and serves as a perfect framework for all narratives about important discoveries and explorations made throughout the following centuries. Clearly, Europe is presented in a scale that is disproportionately big with its actual geographical proportions. Let me show you another perspective of the same part of the world. Now, Mercator projection leads you to believe that Greenland and Africa are of more or less the same size, whereas this European region is actually 15 times smaller than is Africa when you transpose it to the right-hand side here of a more realistic type of projection. Now, this is what is known as Gold-Peters projection, and it is admitted to be the most precise one in terms of size. And you see how Africa is not only more elongated, but much larger than Europe or Greenland for that matter. Now, let me show you a fourth type of projection or geographical map that is also interesting to compare. In 1979, Stuart MacArthur, an Australian guy, brought two modifications to the Gold-Peters projection, literally turning upside down the Euro-centered visions of the Mercator initial geography. First of all, by inverting the north with the south, and also by changing the centering of the frame, which is now centered around Australia, and obviously relegates Europe to a completely marginal, hardly visible place. Now let me show you a fifth interesting map. It's called the orthograph projection, created in 1999 by the Japanese Hashin Minarukama. This would be the more realistic representation known to this day, making allowance for the gaps and distances keeping every country apart from one another. Now, let's go to a last projection, the Chinese one of Hao Xiaoguang, which was adopted in 2013 as the official People's Republic of China's projection, with this vertical version centered around China. So again, we can only be disoriented, of course, by these different perspectives, which of course shake and question our personal projections in space. A first question pops to our mind after having a look at all this. Why should Mercator's projection, which is the least reliable and the oldest one, is still preferred with respect to the other, more updated ones, at least for the people who suffered from these biased previous versions? Well, this question brings us back to the major difficulty of trying to free oneself from the dominating narratives which have already been spread by means of so many different communication channels. It's the same sort of embarrassment we feel when we try to confront some varying paradigms that change basically our habits so much that we're taken out of our comfort zone and we end up feeling too disturbed to adopt this improvement. It's the same sort of feeling you go through when you have to change your glasses prescriptions, basically. And that is the reason why Mercator has remained the prevailing paradigm despite the end of slavery, colonialism, or despite the emerging alternative main powers which could have promoted their trajectory in a different way. So this goes to show that without a systematic reflection work of deconstruction and reconstruction, these prejudices will stay in the way basically of our healing process. The reaction that consists in calling wokeism any critical approach basically of our past historical endeavors is not an answer in my opinion. Of course, for a healing process of our multicultural society and to contribute to this dialogue, I wanted to focus my presentation on the psychological, political, and sociocultural implications of the dominating narratives that exist in the world nowadays, and the extent to which they are being instrumentalized in the current geopolitical context, which poses problem to the extent that even Western researchers, mainly philosophers or anthropologists, have had to question these dominating narratives. It is the case, for example, of Jack Goody, who's an eminent British professor of social anthropology, who very remarkably described how the Western world managed to impose to the rest of the world its own narratives on its own past and on the rest of humankind. But it's also important to remind ourselves that these narratives are not only stories that we tell ourselves in order to glorify our actions or justify our rights of passage, so to speak, on the others. Persons or territories, but it's also the result of a whole reasoning path that structure our thinking and our vision of cosmos by means of a series of categories and a series of lexical repertoires, basically. And in the case of Africa, and a number of webinars that I was honored to be managing for a while, we were in a position to draft a new glossary, basically, of all the terms that people use in order to define nowadays context. And I would like to pay tribute to my colleagues, Martial Zebelinga and Augustin Old, among others, who are co-founders of our Afro Perspective think tank. And in this glossary, instead of establishing a long list of decolonization terms, which would be never-ending, we preferred to opt for a critical methodology that enables us to identify the perspectives or terms that can be polemical, ambiguous, and try to find them equivalent, adequate alternatives, basically. So let me share with you what I call perspective, scheme, paradigm, and then concepts or terms used to illustrate them. What we call schemes are mainly reasoning categories enabling you to understand and express or describe a reality. By paradigm, we mean a proposal that is usually or commonly admitted by a scientific community that more or less explicitly includes a definition of certain concepts and also includes some major facts to establish their scientific truth. And given this very brief summary, basically, of our methodological framework here, I am trying here to show you a table that illustrates basically the way we tried to go about describing these issues. For example, Africa is often seen as a continent of orality without significant civilization. That's the general perspective. But then the scheme that automatically comes behind or at the back of your mind when you're dealing with this perspective is the contrast between prehistory and history. For example, you'll divide systematically Africa between black and white subparts, because we tend to think that certain civilizations, more elaborate or more advanced than others, were not of African origin. We tend to think also that this continent was isolated. And only progressively conquered and populated by Europeans' interventions. And then that leads us to the underlying sub-concept of European discovery and its penetration of the African continent being basically a receiver of an external civilization. So this is leading us to the series of paradigm with pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial histories that are often taught in schools still, and then the concepts behind, such as tribes or animism and paganism, for example, that would be more characteristic of the African culture, and anti-progress or backward with respect to the Western culture, and often contrasting with the technical humanitarian willingness of the European culture. So, and another example at the other end of the spectrum would be that of development. The perspective about development is often connected with the century of enlightenment, as I said, the great discoveries of the 16th century, modernity, sciences, universalism, and humanism, or the conquest of nature, basically. That goes together in hand with a paradigm about linear progress, developed countries, liberal democracies, modern societies, human rights, the leadership of the West, the standard of living with certain economic indexes or human development indexes, trying to quantify the level of well-being in relationship with the equipments or materials and infrastructures that the developed and underdeveloped countries would respectively have. And then there's a whole series of notion of marketing and communication in terms of leisure society, sexual freedom, and modernization that goes also with these schemes and paradigms. And among other Eurocentered perspectives, I'd like to quote a few of them which have important implications. For example, the European exception, basically, that would be stemming from the Greek miracle on the shores of the Aegean Sea, even though the Greek authors themselves explain their inheritance and try to put things in a broader perspective. So this Enlightenment centuries suddenly conferred to the Europeans the right to feel more entitled or better qualified, basically, in virtue of universalist virtues, to defend or to present themselves as the champions of these values and continue to exert some sort of world and global leadership. Therefore, a civilizing mission of Europe sort of ensued and perpetuated itself in the eyes of the rest of the world by always connecting their roots to this miraculous origin and projecting themselves to a series of scientific miracles symbolizing human progress. They present themselves as the least worst choice presented to mankind. Now, in terms of vocabulary, all the discursive tools and lexical iconography, basically, are also put to use by this instrumentalization, basically, as a narratives, pedagogical or political, be it. And all of these concepts and terms were sealed into a sort of fixed language that continues to reproduce itself as the dominating narrative, basically. So transforming such narratives, which maintain or perpetuate a de facto situation of supremacy in terms of knowledge is sustained by, to give you a concrete example, for example, the drafting of the 8 or 9 volume long history of Africa for more than 350 academics and researchers worked over the last 35 years in order to deconstruct in a rigorous way a number of paradigms applying to the African continent. I'd like to quote a few. The paradigm of a sort of very tight African border between the black and white parts and zones of Africa that would be delineated by the great desert belt that was questioned. The paradigm of a continent that would be seen as a sort of crux of other external civilizations suddenly penetrating a void shell has been questioned. The paradigm of a continent, an African continent fixed in its traditions all the way up to the arrival of this European civilization penetrating it. That was also deconstructed because there is a chronology, of course, behind that and specific to the African traditions and civilization. The paradigm of modern civilization as opposed to the wild tropical jungle existing in Africa, whereas Africa was already in contact with Asia and Middle Eastern Europe, and even the different Americas way before the Europeans discovered the existence of this continent. To conclude my theory here, I would like to say that the transformation of this type of narratives is a prerequisite before we can open a serious and fair dialogue in the hope of healing any kind of trauma, because we won't be able to heal ourselves if we keep using the same words and terms as the ones that were associated with the very traumatizing situations that dehumanized some of us human beings. We won't be able to fight against racism and discrimination if we don't change the vocabulary by which and with which racial prejudices were usually expressed. And it's not a matter of semantic change as much as an ethic and fair repairing transformation of the terms I'm talking and thinking of. We need to really emancipate ourselves from a sort of murderous terminology. But the problem, of course, against which we're running, or any goodwill is running, is basically that we cannot alter them without altering the system that generated this vocabulary and that still entertains it structurally. So we need to come to terms with the systemic aspects of this phenomenon, and it cannot be dealt with otherwise than in a multi-dimensional way from a philosophical, socio-political, cultural and educative point of view and perspectives at the same time. All the public spaces where nations elaborate and express their narrative are concerned by this struggle. And perhaps I will be able to share with you later on during our exchange what we started to do with museums, among others. Any transforming initiative calls for the need to change the myths and founding principles of this predatory system that favors the dehumanizing of mankind and the instrumentalization of nature. Since its very birth, the capitalist system or order was built on a racial order that itself led its foundations on a sort of hierarchy between individuals, races, and cultures, which unfortunately prevents and preempts any discussion or dialogue on fairness and equity. And this has been perpetuated by the descendants of those who benefited from slavery or decolonization. So it is an unalienable struggle that we need to lead if we want to seriously apprehend collective healing and well-being. It is a struggle that we need to lead together if we want to co-build some alternative narratives that would not rest on some dominating paradigms pertaining to dominating hierarchies. It's the only way to reestablish and reestablish true links and reconnect basically with transcendental dimensions that will help us to develop more genuine utopias and relationships to nature or between ourselves. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ali. Now we welcome Esther to share some thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Ali for that powerful, powerful breakdown in terms of language. What is a narrative? What is the difference between a narrative and a story? These distinctions are crucial in order for us to get to the reality of a collective healing and not sit in the space of back and forth argumentation. So while a story is an account of real people or imaginary people and events, a narrative is about the choice of which events to relate and in what order. Narrative is about how we choose to tell a story. And we apply different narratives to the same story all the time. That differentiation is crucial because that means that in the world of narrative, where the choice to include or omit, the choice to be silent or to speak, that doesn't just communicate a story, it shapes a people. It shapes how a people is seen and how they see themselves. And it is that work of reckoning with how narrative about oppressive systems has shaped how we see ourselves and how we see each other. It is from that work that as a former journalist, I choose to look specifically at how the narrative of the emotional shows and shapes up in our work and in our worlds. When we think of the word emotional, the story of emotions is often that they are reduced to being not important, that they are negated, that they are gendered, and they are not to be trusted, that they are not part of what is a reliable sense of power or structure. In my work of creating a racial healing roadmap, I wanted to look specifically at the power of the emotional and to bring language to how the emotional is a crucial part of a narrative that upholds oppressive systems. Let me share my screen. So, emotional justice is my response to reckoning with narrative that has shaped us, but also really bringing language to the work and the world of the emotional and how it speaks to oppressive systems. Ali broke down beautifully how these oppressive systems have been structured and the work that they do to create economies. I want to move from the often language of the fiscal economy and how that resource is told, and I want to explore what I call the emotional economy. Emotional justice, a racial healing roadmap and framework that I created. So what does emotional justice do? It creates language to identify the role of the emotional in upholding oppressive systems. It treats the emotional as structural. It breaks down a legacy of untreated trauma. It explores how we are shaped by the language of whiteness. And it identifies the emotional work of each demographic in racial healing and dismantling inequitable systems. This is crucial I am talking to you from Accra, the capital city of Ghana. This is part of a continent that has been fed a narrative of the absence of language, and a language had to be introduced and imposed in order to teach us to communicate. That is a narrative that uses and engages power as a means of reduction in terms of identity. Emotional justice was saying we must create language to identify the role of the emotional and how it shows up and how it shapes us. We treat the emotional as structural because we recognize that it is in how structures are maintained that power is perpetuated or it can be dismantled. And the idea so often is that, of course, emotions are relegated to individual bodies and individual experiences. And that, of course, is true. With emotional justice, we're looking at the emotional as structural, as having a pivotal role in sustaining inequitable systems and perpetrating a violence in the name of progressive economies. A legacy of untreated trauma. We speak a lot about trauma when it comes to the need for collective healing and the systems that shape our modern world: colonialism, enslavement, and apartheid. In emotional justice, we talk about a legacy of untreated trauma, because there is the reality of the trauma as a result of the systems of oppression that shapes our modern world, but there is also the legacy of the untreated trauma and how that shows up and shapes who we are and how we see ourselves. In thinking about narrative specifically, this roadmap explores how we are shaped by what we call the language of whiteness, which I'm about to break down. And crucially, emotional justice argues that in order to get to collectivity, we must start with specificity. And so it identifies the emotional work of each demographic: Black, brown, white, indigenous, to use the binary terms that this work is often broken down into. The emotional work of each demographic in racial healing and dismantling inequitable systems. And I'm going to break down the importance of demography as a narrative in creating the kind of collective healing that will be sustainable and that will move beyond what is often performative gestures or symbolic gestures that do not translate into sustainable practice. So how was emotional justice built? Through research, assignment, and community engagement. This is crucial because it is through this engagement with living bodies, a living people, but in the work of journalism, an entire field whose foundation is about narrative. The work of any journalist, the question that will often be asked when a journalist is telling a story is, what is the angle that you are taking? Another way to say that is, what is the narrative that you choose to share in order to communicate that set of facts? And that multiple journalists can take the same set of facts and create multiple narratives. That matters in understanding that when it comes to oppressive systems, a single narrative has been created and perpetrated that has then created an identity that we must wrestle with. So this roadmap was built through research, assignment, and community engagement over 15 years and 5 cities, 3 countries, and 3 continents: in London, Accra, Philadelphia, and New York, and Cape Town. Storytelling is a huge part of how we engage emotional justice. So I want to break down how this was built through story and narrative. You're looking at 3 pictures of 3 specific assignments of major incidents that I ended up covering as a journalist. So on the far left-hand side at the top, this is Ghana, 40 years of independence. The image on the far left is Black Star Square, and you're seeing thousands and thousands of Ghanaians gathered with their Ghanaian flags. The image in the middle is Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, and stamps marking the 40th. The image on the right is an image of the first president, Kwame Nkrumah. Behind him is my beautiful dad, God rest his soul, and the two little girls are my elder sisters. The image on the bottom left-hand side is Philadelphia. That's the Million Woman March. On the left, that is Eakins Oval in Philadelphia. We're looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of Black women who came from all over America and the world for this event. On the right-hand side, you're looking at an image of Winnie Mandela in the red and the white head wrap. In front of her, the gentleman in the baseball cap and the beard is Dick Gregory. And then the picture on the right is South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. On the right, the top right, you're looking at Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. The image below, again, is Winnie Mandela in a white head wrap. The image on the left are the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners. Right in the front is Desmond Tutu. And the image above is Nchiki Biko, the widow of Steve Biko, who was the father of Black consciousness in South Africa. These stories, these visuals are snapshots of major assignments that helped shape this work and world of emotional justice. What I want to point to is the single most important part of the narrative from the top left-hand side picture, Ghana 40 years of independence, is the person that is missing, and that is my mother. My mother would break her silence about a 30-year, over a 30-year period about what happened the night of Ghana's first military coup in February 1966 that ended the presidency of Kwame Nkrumah and is a major date in Ghana's history. And it would begin a series of military interventions, from military coups to political regime, back to military coups and back and forth. The reason why that image is so important, that my mother missing represents the way we think of narrative and healing. That there are bodies and stories and people that are present, and yet there are those who are absent, who are erased, who are silenced, and yet their experience and their story and their reality shapes entire histories. So my entire history was shaped by my mother choosing to tell a story about a time that I'd always thought about in terms of President Nkrumah and my father, but actually I learned was very much about African women. And that knowledge shaped how I then approached Philadelphia, which then shaped how I approached South Africa. What was the lesson that I learned, particularly in South Africa? That there was a healing process that the world would emulate and applaud, where these two men who became icons of forgiveness engaged a process over a 9-year period that was about healing. But the harm of apartheid was 48 years. So a healing process that takes 9 years and a harm process that's 48 tells a story that we do not honor with our healing investment, the same amount of time that is given to the perpetration of the harm. But it's not just the harm that took place, it's the legacy of that harm. Why does that matter? It matters because it creates a narrative of healing being done on a timeline and a deadline, as opposed to being a process and a practice that is beyond the length of a workshop and actually goes into generations because you're looking at the harm that has been perpetrated. I spoke about the language of whiteness. What is that? It is a narrative. We have all been taught about how the world came to be and our role in it as African, since we're on the continent, Black, brown, indigenous, and white people. It is a narrative that says whiteness built the world, saves the world, and is the world, while Africans, Black people, brown people, indigenous people are savages and children needing saving and civilizing. It is a narrative that shapes how we see ourselves, each other, and how we lead, work, and learn. What is crucial about this narrative that we have all been taught, and I want to make it really clear, it is not specifically just about white people. It's about how the world came to be and our role in it. That narrative taught white people that they are the leaders, and it taught African, Black, brown, and indigenous people as they are the learners. One people leads, one people learn. If Your identity is then shaped by that narrative. And that's the power of the emotional, is that it operationalizes within your heart, your mind, your spirit, and your soul. So you may ideologically have a different understanding and recognize the falseness of the narrative, but it's created an emotional relationship to power that centers whiteness. And that now shapes how you move through the world. That source is Emotional Justice, A Roadmap for Racial Healing, which is the book Dr. Gill mentioned earlier. So the language of whiteness is a narrative that nurtures an emotional relationship to power that centers whiteness. That leads to what we call an emotional worldview, where we see, treat, and believe whiteness is the leader, and Africans, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are the learners. So we broke down the language of whiteness as it relates to the world of emotions to give language to what we're speaking about. 4 terms: racialized emotionality, emotional patriarchy, emotional currency, and emotional economy. Those are the 4 elements of the language of whiteness, and this is what we must unlearn. Racialized emotionality, a world where we add gender, color, context, consequence to universal human emotions. The universal becomes racialized. The racialized is then dehumanized. The dehumanized becomes the ongoing targets of violence. Emotional patriarchy, a society that centers, privileges, and prioritizes the feelings of white men and white people, no matter the cost or consequence to all women and Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. Emotional currency, a society that treats women like currency that appreciates or depreciates according to its service to whiteness, men, and centrally white men, particularly Black women. Emotional economy, a world that makes decisions, acts, creates policy that revolves around the feelings of white men and is relentlessly driven by those feelings, regardless of the harm to the health of a nation. It functions to sow division, to plant seeds that segregate, and to spin narratives that separate. So if you're going to unlearn the language of whiteness, what do you replace it with? We call them the emotional justice love languages. We use love language intentionally because it's about an affirmation, an affirming, and creating a practice that allows you to move from what you must unlearn and replace it with something new. There are 4: intimate reckoning, intimate revolution, resistance negotiation, revolutionary Black grace. Intimate reckoning, it's for white women and men to do the emotional labor of severing their connection to power and race that upholds a white masculinity, centering the subjugation and exploitation of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people and white women. That means to stop defending, supporting, uplifting, and cheering a white masculinity that sustains the language of whiteness and shapes white men's emotional connection to and relationship with power and race. Just in the interest of time, I'll just describe one more and then we'll move on. Number 2, intimate revolution. For Black women and Brown women and Indigenous women globally to unlearn the language of whiteness that teaches them their sole value is labor and connects labor to value and worth. The intersection creates a relationship to labor about value. And that intersection shapes a notion that the only value you serve is the labor that you produce that is outside of yourself. The other 2, 3 is resistance negotiation, and number 4 is revolutionary Black grace. What is important about these 4, the 4 love languages and unlearning the language of whiteness, is they are broken down into demographics. So intimate reckoning is the emotional justice love language of white people, white women and white men. Intimate revolution is the love language of Black people, African people, Brown people, Hispanic people, Indigenous people. Resistance negotiation is specifically about white people and what it means to navigate the feelings that occur when you're being challenged about issues of race in order that you can step into collective healing environments and do the work and come away and continue to do the work. Revolutionary Black grace, specifically about the healing work that needs to be done between global Black people on the continent and throughout the diaspora and global Africa. We all have our emotional work to do, but that work is not the same for every demographic. It is emotional labor We are building an emotional ecosystem, and we are navigating an emotional worldview. In order to navigate an emotional worldview successfully, you must identify it. If you do not identify it, how do you unlearn what continues to be perpetrated in your name? I break all of this down. You see this visual. You're looking at a visual of a Black woman's back. Emotional Justice, A Roadmap for Racial Healing. That's the title of the book. Everything is broken down in that book. So this racial healing roadmap and this framework that I've just described, it is institutionalized and operationalized through the Armagh Institute of Emotional Justice. We're based in Ghana. We work internationally, and we create these innovative racial healing resources via projects, training, and thought leadership that breaks down, but in practical ways, everything that I've just articulated as analysis. These are some examples of our projects. I won't go through all of them, but I'm going to focus on one. Healing Harm, Heeding History. So this project focuses on global racial healing across the continent and the diaspora. And we specifically use the orality, the ancestral powers, and storytelling. So it engages dramatization, and dialogue. It has 3 themes: intergenerational dialogue, notions of belonging, and narratives of power. What we do is that we take the ancestral wise ways, we evolve, digitize, and revolutionize them, because this racial healing roadmap is about evolving the racial healing roadmap of South Africa, and saying that the challenge with that roadmap is it deadlined our healing and it centered whiteness. It was then exported all over the world, but we're dealing in a time of contested narrative about a singular history. No one questions that it was enslavement, but the contestation is the idea that slavery somehow was beneficial even to those who were enslaved. Those contested narratives impede any kind of collective healing. Healing Harm, Heeding History. The next one is in September here in Accra, where we will be bringing people together at the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, a beautiful space. Important, listen to the name, the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, because we're bringing generations of Black people together in person in Accra, but then partnering with an old civil rights organization in America. All of the people that are Black, bringing everybody together to explore what we call the 4H circle. What does it mean to heal harm but heed history? You cannot have a sustained collective healing that is not heeding history. There can be no emotional justice without the equal division of emotional labor. The reason this is crucial is these oppressive systems of enslavement and apartheid and colonialism rested on unequal labor. That there were a whole group of people doing the labor, and there was a group of people who were the beneficiaries of that labor. Importantly, the emotional worldview that has shaped so many of us is that the idea of one person being the leader, one person being the learner, means that there is an expectation that there's always one group doing the emotional labor, being fixed, in other words, being taught, being shaped, and another group leading that charge. That cannot take us to collective healing. And when we talk about collective healing, we're talking about developing a process and a practice that moves and lasts beyond the length of a workshop, but is actually generations deep. This is our work to do. So we are the healers we have been waiting for. We are the dismantlers we have been waiting for. This is emotional justice. That is a crucial point to end on, because our training takes account of the narratives that have shaped us, that have led to this notion of who gets to be the learner and who gets to be the leader. And in developing this international institute that is here in Ghana, we work across the continent, but also in the US and in the UK, developing these resources through projects and training and thought leadership with universities and foundations in the US, with teaching institutions in the UK, developing projects here in Ghana, all of which are designed to say that our collective healing requires a specificity, a nuance, and a detail that understands the power of the emotional in order to transform a narrative that has been singular, but has been devastatingly effective in shaping all of us, Black, brown, white, indigenous. We all have to unlearn the language of whiteness, and the way forward is emotional justice. Thank you.
Let's just take this as a starting point. Many people today, especially the young ones, will join historian Yuval Harari in recognizing that our time now is an age of bewilderment. According to Harari, it says it's an age of bewilderment because the current accounts or narratives that explain who we are and how we shall live have already collapsed. And new compelling narratives are yet to emerge and to guide our collective lives. But you have both offered examples of what new compelling narratives might look like. But I wonder if you would say more about how such narratives might be invited and promulgated in the public spaces, and what would make humanizing narratives compelling, so compelling that people will immediately feel inspired by them rather than start tearing each other apart and bickering about them.
I'm trying to respond to this very deep question that you have asked. First of all, and to respond to the issue raised by one of the people who asked question, I'm not antagonizing science with and other knowledge. I just want to put the focus on how science has been instrumentalized throughout the history to justify domination and exploitation. Now, science, of course, science is a way of knowing the world that has been developed. And the problem is not the science, it's the monopoly of science. And science is like religious. They claim the truth and the monopoly. That is the problem with science, like with the other with the religions who say each religion is claiming to be absolutely the truth. And science has this kind of discourses, and this is really problematic. So science is, of course, useful. I think science was based on there is a lot of foundation for the science. Science is mostly concerned by what is measurable, but what's quantifiable. So, and all what is not measurable and quantifiable and experimentable is left out of the science. Okay, if science is modest and say, okay, we focus on what is quantitative, what can we measure, and the rest exists, and we don't claim it doesn't exist, it's okay. There will be even collaboration, and there is already a collaboration between scientific knowledge producer and other knowledge producer as well, who are trying to work together. So it's not antagonism, it's just refusing the monopoly of science to explain the world and to explain I think this is important. Now, narratives, of course, the narratives are useful. I mean, human beings, this is in our nature. We have to tell stories. We have to, between us, we have to project ourselves. We have to transcend our lives by the narratives. So narratives is very useful. How we can make sure that the narrative that we are telling, they are not harmful narrative for others. I think that is the issue. And I can say that most of the narratives of most of the people are in a certain way always harmful to others people. That's why I separate the mythology and narratives. Mythology is okay, it's the sky, that I think is beautiful. We can like all the mythology of the world are really very beautiful, and there is no problem, you know, when the people of Amazonia, they are telling their beautiful cosmogony, and it's really beautiful. But the narratives became a problem when they try to explain our human activities and human actions. And that's where we need to try to find narratives that are not harmful against others, and we have to pull the lesson from this harmful and toxic narrative that we have been developing across the history. And I think what Aster is doing with her institute, taking this aspect of the emotionality to address many issues that we always consider as a very something that is concrete, material, and like power sharing, economy, and using this notion of emotion to have this angle. And I think it is really very important. So that's what I can say for the time being about the question raised by some of the participants and the question that you raised, Sherto.
Esther?
It's such a powerful point when somebody talks about humanizing narratives so they're not harmful. And what I would say is that the one thing we are going to have to accept is that the reality of the systems that have shaped the world as it is guarantee that what humanizes one set of people dehumanizes another. Not because of the fact of dehumanization, but because of the reality that we have developed this notion of an identity about ourselves, that we are this ABC set of people. That is the issue. And so the idea that, for example, racism is challenged, the mere fact of it being challenged gets reduced to this person is trying to create harm. But you cannot get to a collective healing without navigating the incredibly thorny waters of the dehumanizing structures that have been built in order to dehumanize. And so what people are actually, when they say, how do you humanize without being harmful? The challenge with that statement is that it removes the natural panorama and breadth of emotions that will occur in order to humanize. And in other words, to get to what I call the good stuff. So what does that mean? It means that so often in these spaces, what happens, let's just really break it down and be absolutely practical and real, because we've seen it happen again and again. So if white people may feel that if they are that world was part of the world of enslavement, the idea of people talking about race and racism, people feel maligned, they feel accused, they feel defensive, they have a whole set of feelings, and they want to be able to navigate those in a space of collective healing. That is why in emotional justice, we literally create language that is specifically for each demographic to work through some of that before they come into collective space. Because the challenge is, what part of the dehumanization when it comes to the world of the emotional is to strip, particularly Black people, of their human emotions. So rage, vulnerability, pain, all of those things have been stripped. It has required people to literally do what we call emotionally rearrange themselves around the beneficiaries of enslavement in order to keep people happy. And that if they didn't do that historically, there were repercussions that could be life and death. So you cannot, that is why we talk about healing harm, healing history. You cannot get to humanization without navigating the very rocky territory of whose emotions were removed from them. And introducing them, you're going to be dealing with fires in order to get to water.
Well, it's interesting that you say you cannot develop one set of a narrative that is humanizing without this being a dehumanizing narrative for others. But I want to pursue that a little bit, Amar, if I may. W.B. Du Bois and his major intellectual effort was the narration of American history. And yeah, he did his research in Philadelphia, and so the black folks and the souls of black folks, and that's captured in that book. But he did his research in such a way that when he narrated the American history, it portrayed African American from rather than as a historical victim to a historical actor. So I want to say that it might be possible. Well, I agree with what you said in terms of in such some narratives, when you try to highlight one's own humanity, it may posit some kind of threat to other people's identity, but that is possible. In some ways, Ali probably could share in terms of your work, because many global museums tend to have such transformative potential. We invite people in this space, not so that one group of people feel dehumanized or another group of people feel humanized, but more often say, we come to space, recognize that there is not such a thing as us and them. We are in it together. So how do we claim such stories? And so that's something that I just want to explore further. And maybe this also connected to your early point, contrasting specificity with the collectivity. Can we actually allow the collectivity to actually hold the specificities? And one of our colleague here, Sei Hilu, and he was saying that, well, she or she, they were saying that why can't there be no narrative coexist, but in a way that not being in a non-antagonistic space.
So can I just speak to that? Is that okay? Is that okay if I can speak to that? So I'd say two things. I think specifically to the work that we do, which is about developing collective healing as a process and a practice. And the reason that I say a process and a practice is I think that the power of intellect is to offer us ideas of how we might reimagine the world that we would like to create. The reality of practice is developing a journey to make that world possible. So what I deal with is the journey that we're creating to make that world possible. And I think that we can absolutely get to coexistence, but we cannot get to coexistence without navigating some of the very thorny territory that led to the kind of division of existence that has shaped our world. Because the challenge that you have is when you seek to develop coexistence, minus what is an element of the absolute pain and trauma and rage created by the language of whiteness and the violence that it has perpetrated against Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. What you are really then doing in terms of the journey is silencing an entire element of lived experience in order to get to another space. And you cannot sustain, you can have a moment, a feeling of being healed, but you cannot sustain a collective healing practice and process without navigating that thorny territory. And where we have seen it, because we've done this so many different times, where we see it fail again and again, is the attempt to get to coexistence, the attempt to get to a collectivity without dealing with the specificity. That is why we have trainings that are very specifically for example, for white women, where we talk specifically about what does it mean to have a relationship to power that centers whiteness? What does that mean for you? How does it shape how you show up in the world? How does it shape how you come into space? How does it shape how you're able to listen or to be challenged? Those things matter because in doing that individual demographic work, when you then come into collective healing space, you have an awareness of your emotional worldview that can enable you to better engage with others. The last thing I will say is that we've also seen massive examples in major public spaces, in museums, in exhibits, where the failure to pay attention to specificity means that the very curation that we're trying to develop ends up perpetrating harm. We had the incidents, I think it was at the MoMA. Was it the MoMA? I think it was the MoMA, where an award-winning Black British artist goes to see this amazing exhibit that's exploring Blackness and rest, a beautiful place for people to come together. And she ends up being thrown out of an exhibit about rest and Blackness because there is a white couple who come in, and she says to them, oh, they were being very, very loud. She said, oh, this is a space about rest, is trying to have a collective moment. But that person then engages because they feel maligned and they feel accused. They report the other person. The Black woman gets thrown out. It becomes a major issue that becomes global news all over the world. But the real lesson is that when you get to the bottom of the story, the artists had said to the museum, in order for this space to be collective, you need to pay attention to the specifics of developing models that show people how to engage, so that when they come together, they know how to engage. We keep trying to skip what has been the violence and the violation to get to a place of collectivity. And our experience is that it may work for a moment, but it doesn't enable you to sustain a journey and a process and a practice that ends up transforming the world that we're trying to transform.
Ali, museum and public space is your territory.
Exactly. First of all, I completely agree with Esther. We have to do that journey. We have to pass through that process to come to reconcile. But we can, and I think rushing too much for that reconciliation without passing on the different steps will be counterproductive. And I think Esther, we have discussed that the Commission Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, in a certain way, has shortcoming because they wanted to go too fast to push to the reconciliation. And I think we missed a lot of stage. And now this country is suffering for having passed very quickly to that stage. So it's important to pass through that processes. Now, I think the history, the healing of history is for me, really the most important achievement action and enterprise to do. And because the history is not only a scientific discipline as the others, it's really a discipline that has epistemological virtue. Because through the history, we understand what happened and where are the source of what we are thinking of our actual prejudices and the narratives that we are still telling. So knowing the source of this is very important. So that's why the healing from history is important. And I think we could not have reconciliation, a dialogue around that, if the other party is not ready to change the way the history is told. You cannot talk about the great discovery, if you are serious, in front of Africans, indigenous people, and continue to keep that vocabulary. When there was an extermination and enslavement of whole peoples. So it should be changed. And I think most of the scholars don't know more use, but the mass media and the televisions and cinema is still continuing to propagate this ideology of the great discovery. But what I would like to say, museum is really, for me, the perfect place to begin the work. First of all, because they have a certain flexibility, a certain relative independence of interpretation to bring people, and it's a space where generally nations and countries are elaborating, developing their narratives. And it's a place where the visitor come, they have the sound, they have the image, and it will be a really appropriate place to begin to the construction and dismantlement of certain narratives, and to begin to introduce. So that's why we have really selected the museum as the space of experimental space. I think in April we have organized a symposium in La Réunion in the Indian Ocean, on museum facing slavery, how to reconcile narratives on this common and painful heritage. And there is a series of recommendations that came out from that symposium that we are happy to share with all the museum professionals across the world. But there is that the museum is a really important place, and the museum is not only what the people see. I mean the front. The museum is also the behind all the So where we should bring communities to come to discuss exactly what you are doing, Esther, about the intergenerational, to discuss, to agree on what we want to put in the front. So the museum is not a specialist who come with their science and who define what the visitor should see. Museum is the community who decide what to see, how to see, and then specialists then can be called upon to see how they can put that in place by respecting, of course, the history, the historical fact, and scenography and all that. But it is the museum is the place where community can discuss and where they can showcase the consensus. I mean, the common consensus that they agree on upon, and it's a space, very important space. Of course, cinema is another way, the television, but that is still a long way to go to convince people who are controlling this mass media to play the game and to help. Although I see that, for instance, Netflix and all that, they are now producing more and more films and series from made, but I think there's a long way to go.
I just want to second that. I really agree with you, Ali, and I would say that I'm going to be at the museum at the University of Stellenbosch next month, doing an emotional justice masterclass, and we're bringing artists because we use storytelling and drama to really get to the heart of what I think some of the listeners and some of the contributors have talked about, the part that they think of as antagonizing. But we use art as a way to really, what we say is to connect to the heart of the issue and not have to litigate the approach to the issue. Why? Because we all know the experience of watching an extraordinary performance, being moved by a piece of music, watching a piece of film that then allows you to have the kind of discussion, because you're so moved, that can actually jumpstart the kind of work that needs to happen. We're also very excited to engage with museums, because one of the things that I think is really important, as somebody who's both a storyteller and a journalist, is that with with museums curating and developing exhibits that are about navigating this thorny work, there is such an opportunity, because it is actually a place of a natural, diverse community, because everybody doesn't know each other who's coming to an exhibit. But for us in emotional justice to create what we call the EJ listening booths, both digital and living spaces, where those who attend can then share what they feel and then leave a note for the person coming after them. Not necessarily a written note, but they can do it orally. It can be done in the language of a particular person. What does that allow? It allows me to hear you. I don't know you. I've never met you. I can't see you. But I can now be connected through the experience of this exhibit to actually have a conversation across culture, across creed, across color. But we're now, and that is also part of collective healing. And I think museums are a perfect space. And as somebody who, one of the things we're doing is called the Emotional Justice Student Ambassador Program, because we're going to be working with the University of Stellenbosch, is bringing these students from different parts of the space and say that museums are a place where you curate an experience. So getting these students from different parts of the world to create, in this case, it's going to be a podcast. Why? To allow students who don't know each other to cross barriers and boundaries and hear each other. They won't meet, but one set of students will get this curated listening experience from another set of students, and they can hear each other in ways that they have never done so before. And I think the future of a museum needs to have these living sound booths, these living healing booths that allow for communication and exchange done in each person's individual language, but they can then be shared and they can be engaged as an act of collective healing that can also be moved all the way through across education, generations, that can be used again and again and again and again. That's a practical way of thinking about collective healing from the work that we do.
Thank you. I think between both of you, some of the questions from the audience, like Bonfas Betty and Angie Yondema Mena, and who basically ask what strategies we can use, how we can transform this experience in the community. And I think these questions probably have been answered, but I just want you each take 1 minute, just 1 minute, to comment on the structure. How do these narratives contribute to that structural transformation so desperately needed for our human community at this moment?
Well, I have said in my presentation that by putting in question the foundational myth of the dominant system, because when we talk about structure, we have to go to the system, and this system is the capitalist system. And going to the myth that it is using all the assumptions and principle that it's using, and deconstructing that, because it is a system that has a very strong narratives about the fact that the human beings are only led by their egoistic interests, that there is the invisible hand of the market that arranges everything, that the trade make people come together, and there is if there is more trade, there will be no war. While we know that the capitalist exchange is based on military invasion and conquest. So, of course, we have to begin to challenge this foundational myth on which the system is founded, and I think if we transform that narratives, I think we are contributing to change structurally the others, because many other narratives are secondary narratives in a certain way. It came from this. So we have to attack the pillar, the pillar. And after that, the rest may easily be dismantled. That's what I think.
Thank you, Ali. Esther, before you take that 1 minute, one of our audience, Andrew Holloway, was asking, what are the essential human qualities necessary, for this structural change? So can you fold that question into your answer, please?
Well, I think the answer is given by the Ubuntu philosophy.
Yeah.
Is the value that I am because you are, and what I am depend of what you are, and we can only be reach a well-being together, and not in a competitive way, or So I think the Ubuntu philosophy is the response of this question. We have already philosophy of humanness, of humanity, that is already how we can revalorize and revitalize that kind of philosophy, and inject into all what we are doing in the different area, in politics and in economy. That's, I think, what is to be done. But how to revalorize this endogenous philosophy and knowledge is in itself a challenge. And that's why in Afrospective we are focusing our work on the revalorization of first understanding those endogenous knowledge, and then trying to revalorize them.
Thank you. Esther, final words.
Very briefly, the human quality that we need is willingness. The willingness to stay when we feel challenged. The willingness to recognize that ideology is no substitute for the practical work that we must do if collective healing is going to be a reality, and not simply the illusion of inclusion or the illusion of transformation. The language of whiteness is a narrative whose love language is violence and violation. And it treats anything that threatens that, not with recovery, but with repercussions. That narrative shapes us. So it's not enough to say, I am because you are. The truth is, I am because I have been shaped to be this way, and then I have been shaped to see you this way. There is unlearning we have to do, and there's a replacement that we have to do. That is structural work that connects both the individual to the institutional and back. And a circle of willingness to do that work is how we transform narrative.
Thank you. Thank you so much. For those of you who are interested in Judith, welcome. And we're sorry you can connect with Esther separately. But for those who are interested in knowing more about collective healing and our work in UNESCO and how UNESCO is going to disseminate this knowledge, please visit our website and on the Collective Healing Initiative website. And on behalf of this audience, and first of all, on behalf of the presenters, I thank the audience for your active engagement. And on behalf of the audience, I thank both of you. I thank you for your absolutely inspirational talk. For now, it's thank you from all of us.
Thank
Until
you
next
very
time.
much.
Thank you so much.